Good morning, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're continuing our conversations about the gurus of self-realization. Today is the second day about Sri Yukteswar. Get all of my little equipment. There we go. Let's say a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to attune ourselves to your inward presence, so that we may do our duty in this world joyfully, enthusiastically, but with constant remembrance that we are in this world by thy grace, that everything we do is to be an instrument of your presence. Guide us and bless us and bring us safely home to thee. Om. Peace. Amen. So, today is more about Sri Yukteswar. Sri Yukteswar is considered to be a Gyan avatar. Gyan means, it's that aspect of Raja Yoga which people often translate it as wisdom, but it's important to understand exactly what it is. Yesterday we ended up talking a lot about Sri Yukteswar's carpet, so I sort of want to bring all of that into a clearer focus so we can really understand what Sri Yukteswar has to give us. Gyan Yoga, the practice of Gyan, many people think of it as being intellectual or philosophical, which of course it has an element of that because it is the intellectual philosophical side of things that inspires the actual practice of Gyan. But in one of Swami's commentaries, I actually think it's a reading related to the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita. It might even be a Sunday reading. You have to forgive me because sometimes the sources merge in my mind by this point. But he actually talks about Gyan Yoga is not being intellectual. Gyan is the attitude that this world is a dream. And therefore, nothing in this world, the premise of Gyan Yoga is neti neti. That far from working out our karma through action in this world, we constantly simply reject the reality of the world altogether. It's a very difficult path. That's how Krishna describes it in the Bhagavad Gita. And he encourages Arjuna to be a yogi. And in that context, and this is a nuance that I really only understood recently, a yogi starts with what is. The yogi is working with the fact that he's in a physical body and that the energy currents flow a certain way within his body, and so he begins to do those practices which reverse the flow of energy that change his life experience. And so he's sort of accepting the reality of this world and working with it. In pure Gyan, and this is how it's been explained to me, or how I've read it from Swamiji, it's just that we just don't even acknowledge the world. And that's why Krishna says it's a very hard path. Very few people can follow it. It's more practical to be a yogi. It's more practical to work with the energy that's there. Now, Sri Yukteswar taught Kriya. So it wasn't as if he didn't meditate or didn't live in his body, because of course he did. But he expressed it as this complete disinclination to participate in the world. And that was when, as I mentioned yesterday, when Master wanted to replace his rug, he just said, that's your world. Relating to that world out there is what you do. I don't have to do that. And in a sense, Sri Yukteswar didn't have to do it because Master did it on his behalf. And there was even, these are sort of things that happened. Rumors got back to Sri Yukteswar when Master was in America, that Master was doing things that were not really faithful to the highest teachings, because he was advertising and he was being somewhat sensational in his lectures. He was creating a phenomenon with his demonstrations. Master was with his demonstrations of more than normal powers and controls over his body and strength. And Master would sometimes have doctors come up and take his pulse, and he would have a different heartbeat in different wrists. Like this, he'd have a doctor on each side. This pulse would be one, right hand pulse would be one, left hand pulse would be another. Then he would stop the pulse on one side and keep it going on the other. I mean, these were remarkable things to see, and Master did it because it attracted attention, and got people there and got people interested. And it was a very dramatic way to say that Master was not ordinary and had something unusual to offer. And as it happened, so I've heard the story, rumors got back to Sri Yukteswar that Master in some way was not being faithful to the teachings. And Master had to explain to his own guru. He says, you can work with the pure gold. He said, I have to mold that gold into jewelry. And apparently, in order to make the pure gold into something that will hold as a ring or a piece of jewelry, you have to add a little impurity to it. So Master sort of justified it by that. I can't, if I if I present myself as you present yourself, then no one will come. And what is the point? And to make jewelry is not a desecration. But Sri Yukteswar's position was to just be outside this world altogether. That he trained any disciples and that he trained Master was sort of as far as he was going to go. But he also participated in the world when necessary. It's famously told in Autobiography of a Yogi, Master supported himself and his family by skillful use of the property that he had inherited. And when some relatives unscrupulously tried to take his property from him, he went into the courts to protect it. I don't know whether, I believe he initiated the lawsuits, but I couldn't say that for sure. But Sri Yukteswar's disinclination toward the world did not extend to the point of allowing a dharma to triumph. And when he trained his disciples and was very precise with them, it was because he was training them not to be tamasic, not to be low energy, not to allow dull habit to cloud their thinking. And so when disciples tracked mud into the house or made a mess in the house, even if Sri Yukteswar didn't really care about the house, he cared about the consciousness of his disciples, because the consciousness of his disciples was the reality that Sri Yukteswar was working with. The manifestation of that was just for him a sign of what that consciousness was, but it's the consciousness that he wanted to change. And so when we ourselves find ourselves, as we often do, caught up in this world and things that we don't quite understand, or we don't like, or we don't know what the right perspective is, or we're having difficulty holding the right perspective. It's very easy to speak about this world as a dream. It doesn't matter what happens to us. The only thing that matters is what we become through what happens to us. I mean, all of these on a sunny afternoon are really just wonderful things to sit and read and contemplate. But the struggle between our vulnerability to the experiences of this world, the deep longings that people have, that we have in our hearts for certain experiences, for certain confirmations of our worth, for success, for recognition, above all for love. I mean, these are very deep within us. And the spiritual path is this constant struggle between the pull of all those vrittis and the awareness that we have that what we hope to gain by diving into them and experiencing all that they promise and what we know to be true on the highest level, that's really where the dilemma comes from. And what Sri Yukteswar has to give us is is the truth of Gyan Yoga. That's why he was called that. I find it very helpful on the spiritual path. This is, of course, my own way. But I find it very helpful to be very clear as I can be, about what the basic philosophical principles are. Even just thinking about Sri Yukteswar, his indifference to the things of the world. There's another story Master tells, I think, an autobiography, about how Sri Yukteswar even let the ashram building sort of fall down a little bit around him, and there was a certain roof tile that was precarious on the roof, and Master said it was so precarious that whenever the ashramites had to expose themselves to the place where the tile could fall on their head, he said they would run through that space so that this wouldn't be the moment when the tile fell. And when Master spoke to Sri Yukteswar and said, "Sir, allow me to fix this," Sri Yukteswar said, "As long as I'm living, that tile will stay on the roof." And it was like, what difference does it make after that? It's just a tile. No one's going to be hurt by it, so just let it be there. And then, in fact, it did stay, and then right after Sri Yukteswar died, it fell, just as he said. Now, of course, you can be negligent like that if you have the power to sustain it. You can't say that just as an affirmation. In autobiography, it's also the very tough story is told about how Master was able to take his young students across a very dangerous path above a waterfall, because he could inspire them with confidence. And before they would cross, he would have the boys say, "Do you believe in God? Do we believe in God? Do we believe in God's protection?" And then Master would take them across this dangerous path, and they would all cross safely. But later, another teacher tried to imitate Master and had the boys all affirm that they had faith in God's protection. And they crossed over that path, and one of the boys fell and was killed, because it was an affirmation. It was not, it was presumption on the part of that teacher. And that is also just a very fine line that we ourselves have to walk, being absolutely sincere and authentic on the spiritual path is a very complicated question, and one of the most challenging questions that we have, because the teaching and the example of Sri Yukteswar that will actually just lift us out of this world is also very enticing if we have a disinclination to put out the energy to relate to this world. And Sri Yukteswar's disinclination for the world had nothing to do with his unwillingness to relate to it, nor was he in any way working with a suppressed desire to have the things of the world. And this is where we have to be very honest and very careful with ourselves, because if we feel afraid that our desires are not going to be fulfilled, or if we want to have certain things, but again, are either afraid that God won't be pleased by our desires, or that we won't be able to fulfill our desires, and the safest way to protect myself is to reject them. I call it the preemptive strike. We think the world is going to reject us, so we reject the world first. Ramakrishna, one of the many charming conversations he had with a disciple, was someone came to him and said, my wife has left me, I've lost my job, I no longer have a place to live, I want to be a monk. And Ramakrishna said, it is not you who have renounced the world, it's the world that has renounced you. And that's not true renunciation. So Sri Yukteswar, when he looked at the things of the world, they just looked like nothing to him. You have to really put your consciousness into you have to project with imagination what his consciousness was really like. It would be just like when a child comes up to you with, a little toy, comes up with you with a toy truck and a little dolly, and sort of wants you to treasure them the way he treasures them, put them away where it's safe. When I was about 4 years old, my next door neighbor and I, we did sculpture one day, and this is, I mean, like, this is an extremely vivid memory for me. I have read, and I believe it from my own experience, that sometimes when little children feel that they're being magnificent as dancers or painters or singers, watch me, mommy, watch me while I do ballet, and then the child just waves a few scarves around the room. But sometimes they're living in a previous incarnation, when in fact they did have talent and they did have skill, and their own experience of what they're doing is not at all in a child's body. And I was about 4 years old, and my friend and I did sculpture. And sculpture was, we took some dirt from the ground and mixed it with water and made mud, and then we sculpted it. And I remember my piece was 3 balls of mud piled on top of each other, like a triple scoop of ice cream, or a snowman without a face. 3 balls of mud. And I remember trying to persuade my mother to put it in the oven, because I needed to cast it. I didn't have the word cast. I mean, I thought of it later as pottery, but it wasn't pottery. I wanted it cast in bronze. It was extremely important to me that we preserve my work. And I was so frustrated because I couldn't persuade her how important it was for me to preserve my work. She refused to put my mud balls in the oven. And just tried to explain to me, if she turned on the oven, it wouldn't come out the way I wanted. But it's so vivid in my mind. I mean, it's one of my, not quite my earliest, but one of my earliest memories. It's so strong because I saw something very different than she saw. Okay, I'm using that as an image because that's how it is when we come to the masters with, I want a child, I want a son who will do this, I want a wife, I want a house, I want a job. The masters, it's not like for them that they have to try. My mother didn't have to try to be detached from my 3 mud balls. They were just 3 mud balls. That's all that they were. I was very attached to them because they were important to me. But as an adult person, in the eyes of a master, that's exactly what it looks like. We think that this is so important, and the master knows that he can't just say, no, it isn't, because we won't understand that. So he has to work with us to help us understand that, in fact, this really is just a mud ball. And what you think is going to happen is really not going to happen. So we have to work with ourselves realistically, because if we just assume from the outside the garb of what we're supposed to look like, and Swami Kriyananda would talk about this often, that often he even said many people who end up in the role of a teacher, either because they have ambitions to be teachers, spiritual teachers, or because they're just not mature yet in that role, they assume the accoutrements of it. They assume the look of it. But Swamiji said, and it's very important to understand, true spirituality grows from the inside. Everything that's living and real grows from the inside. Think about it. I mean, just starting with the sperm and the ovum. You start with the sperm and the ovum, and then the physical body grows from there. It's not like the sperm and the ovum go walk inside of an already formed body that's been made by 3D printing or something like that, and then the sperm and the ovum walk into it, and voila, there's a body. It actually, literally, the life force expresses itself and expands like this. So with us and our spirituality, it's the jiva inside. It's the center of the empyrean, as Master described it when he was having a state of cosmic consciousness. It's within our hearts. And it's the feeling side of ourselves. This is why people think it's paradoxical. But Sri Yukteswar, when he wrote, his very jnanic, very wisdom-oriented, story about the holy science, he ends by saying, you can't take one step on the spiritual path without love. But that was an esoteric comment also. It was not just, oh, I love you, God, I love you, God. It's not the kind of outward. He was talking about a very deep inner reality because the center point of the Empyrean, of the whole, and the whole of creation, spirit is center everywhere, and it's centered in our feeling nature, and our feeling nature, our divine feeling nature, not our emotional nature. And that's how people get confused by the word love. Love is not I desire, I want. Well, let me phrase that differently, because it depends on which I. When it's the divine I, that's different. But that's the divine feeling nature. And when we love, love is like the air that expands the balloon. And so our desire for God is, as this feeling nature within us refines and expands. And so it's not like I try to become something. It's that I do discipline myself, I do practice, I do constantly focus on the ideals that I'm trying to realize. But that what that practice creates is that creates a spontaneous expansion of our bliss nature, of our true nature. And it begins to simply, to as it expands, it pushes away, or the way I see it in my mind, it's like we're wearing a pretend costume and our real self is inside. And as it gradually expands, little bits of that false costume are broken away by the pressure of it. So whatever we manifest on the outside spiritually, when it comes from inside, there's no gap, there's no break. When we merely put on, okay, now I'm a monk, this is how I behave, now I'm a renunciate, now I'm a disciple of Master, now I'm going to be in tune with Sri Yukteswar, I'm going to let my house disintegrate, I'm not going to repair the roof. We sort of like, this is what it looks like to be a gyan, and I want to be a gyan, so this is what I'm going to look like. But there's a gap, because without that, the actual spontaneous expansion of the feeling nature of ourselves, we'll have the costume on the outside, we'll have the feeling develop to this point, and then there'll be this gap. And this is why people go along for a certain time and then they just crack, because of that space. So sometimes those who look the best really are not strong at all. And many times those who don't look like that much necessarily are actually much deeper in the teachings, because whatever they are is completely sincere and it's completely coming from who they are. So Sri Yukteswar's vibration is an extremely powerful vibration for just keeping us austerely honest, because he was very austere, and austerity has a real place. I mean, we have to be tough with ourselves. This is not the spiritual path is not for people who are looking for this path is not for people who are looking for an easy ride. And that's the other thing that Sri Yukteswar presents to us. It's like, what did I expect? I remember about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years into being part of Ananda, there was a kind of a day of reckoning that we all came to. Partly it was, let me finish an actual sentence here. At some point early on, I believe even before I moved to Ananda, because the image I have in my mind is from living in the apartment I was in San Francisco, from which I moved to Ananda village. And I remember reading the phrase, portable paradise. Master said, we all have within us a portable paradise, and it's accessible by going inward in the silence of meditation, and you always have it with you. It's portable because wherever you go, it's with you. That phrase, for some reason, stayed in my mind, and I knew that it was something that you developed the ability to access. And for reasons unknown to me, I thought it would take 5 years. I have no idea, but I just got that little idea in my mind. Of course, I wasn't really stuck on it, because as soon as I moved to Ananda and began to have satsang with Swamiji and really began to learn, everything else went out the window, and I was entirely concentrated on what I was being told. But I think all of us, it's kind of like, well, I think of it like this. Sometimes people like to read the end of the book. Swami would always read the end of a work of fiction, a novel, to see if it had a happy ending before he would read it. He said, "I've had too much sorrow in my life to read sad books." I said, "Sir, doesn't it spoil the book to read the happy ending first?" He said, "No," he said, "as a writer, I find it interesting to see how he's going to get there." And so I think, spiritually speaking, sometimes we have the big chapter book, which is our incarnation. And sometimes right at the beginning, we get to read the happy ending. Sometimes we have special experiences. Sometimes we just have insights and we just realize. And then the book flips back over and we start on page 1. And we have to go through all those other pages and experiences before we reach the happy ending of this incarnation, which is not likely to be the happy ending of the whole saga, but it's a nice start. But so a lot, there's a certain point on the spiritual path as we begin to mature, when we begin to realize what we've really gotten ourselves into. And I remember, as the group of nuns, the young women, that we were so enthusiastic and really so happy. But it was like, this is how we put it to ourselves. We just dove into the lake and we were swimming to the island. We were just swimming and swimming and swimming. And then at a certain point, the island didn't seem to be as close as we had thought it was going to be. And we're sort of we're pretty far from shore. We look back, swimming back is not really an option, but the island is a lot farther away than we thought. And we're kind of treading water, thinking about it, trying to decide what to do next. And that's what happens on the spiritual path. That portable paradise is there, but 5 years was rather an arbitrary number. Of course, it was an incentive, and Divine Mother was playing with me. But Sri Yukteswar tells us that this is serious. This is not something we just do in our spare time, and this is not something, a lot of times people who come on the path are people who are used to success, because we have a certain mastery over ourselves. You have to have a certain mastery over yourself before you even come on the path of self-realization. So we have a certain mastery. This is what someone called the dark side of meditation. There was a whole article in Yoga Journal decades ago. The dark side of meditation is aggressive type A people take up meditation because they're so stressed. Then they find out that the goal of meditation is absolute perfection. So they make themselves totally neurotic, trying to be absolutely perfect in meditation. And there's truth in it, because the spiritual path is a very long, very different. And it's not that you apply your will and paste it on you. It's that you're growing a plant. And you can feed that plant absolutely everything that it needs, and you can mother it every single day, and it will just simply grow according to its own nature. And that's where Sri Yukteswar comes in. Things are simply what they are. He's not going to sugarcoat it. He's not going to flatter you. He's not going to be extra nice to you just because you want him to be. He's just going to say it like it is. And that's wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful once we get the courage to just be in the truth. Why would we not want to be in the truth? Oh, I can think of lots of reasons why we don't want to be in the truth. But we need to be in the truth. And we need to just cultivate that plant in the way that it will actually grow. Sri Yukteswar defined tapasya, which usually means austerity, and does mean austerity. He described it as patience, which I think is a marvelous way to understand even his whole vibration. He was patient. He didn't compromise because he didn't need to compromise, because he was patient. We just stand in the truth, and if we just hold to it courageously, determinedly, and patiently, that little plant inside of us will pretty soon become this giant tree, and everything that was in its way will just be knocked aside by its ever expanding power. God bless you, my friends.